Hi there. This is just a quick recap of what we would have covered in class yesterday, just to make sure we stay on track. Remember, last time we were talking about how to measure processor speed. We talked about some different ways, and then what the best way was. Please remember what the best way was. And we left off talking about, how quickly a processor handles instructions, and those instructions in the CPU are stored in registers as memory space. So we're going to talk for a minute about registers. There are two types: general purpose and special purpose registers. Obviously, for different things, general purpose registers can be used for storing anything. Special purpose registers are special. We don't need to get any more detailed than that. And registers, the size of the register is actually measured in words. This is the basic unit of data for how we measure register size in CPUs. We don't talk in terms of word size anymore. We tend to talk about bit size. So a 32-bit processor, a 64-bit processor, this is just the width of the register. So, for example, my first computer actually was a 4-bit processor. And then 8, 16. Most computers that you buy these days, at least consumer models, are going to be at 64-bit processor, which means a 64-bit word size, which means it can process things 64 bits at a time. That's the width of the register, the amount of storage space it has. So the next leap might be 128-bit CPUs. Who knows? So just remember that the word size is the width of the register. However, you would think that kind of making the word size bigger and bigger and bigger, 128, 256, would be better, but not necessarily, because you run into problems if the data you're manipulating isn't that big. And so you have inefficiencies if the word size is greater than the program data size or smaller than the program data size. Really, the CPU is going to be the most efficient if it matches as closely as possible the program data size that it's manipulating and the word size. So to give you a little more background, I want to show you a quick video just to illustrate. Hang on a second. Okay, here we go. This guy obviously has an accent, but you should be able to follow.
This video will cover how to install an Intel box processor and thermal solution in an LGA1150 socket. First, let's look at what comes in an Intel box processor package. Box processors typically contain the processor, thermal solution, and product manual. And every Intel box processor is backed by Intel's 3-year limited warranty and technical support.
Thermal solution.
Now,
It's a
let's
fan.
talk about some of the things to be aware of before the actual installation process. Prior to installation, it is a good idea to capture the processor markings in case you ever need to contact Intel customer support. Looking at the i5-4570S processor top side, here are the lines that are important to capture: the Intel processor number, the processor spec number and CPU speed, the finished process order, the partial assembly test process order. It is also a good idea to record the Intel part number and manufacturer line of the thermal solution.
The thermal solution.
Once the processor is removed from the protective clamshell, don't touch the bottom side contacts or components. Grip the processor by the edges. Leave the protective cap that covers the board socket until the processor is installed. If you do remove the cap, be very careful never to touch the socket pins, as this could damage the board. Before installing the thermal solution, make sure all 4 fasteners are in the correct position. They should be in the full clockwise position. And when handling the thermal solution, be careful not to disturb the pre-applied thermal interface material on the other side. Now, it's time to prepare the desktop board for the processor installation. The first step is to grab the retention handle and push it down, and move it out to release the cover, and move the handle back until the top plate is fully open. Now, let's install the processor in the socket. Open the clamshell the processor came in and grab the processor by the edges and lift the processor out. Locate the pin 1 indicator on the board and match it with the pin 1 indicator on the processor, along with the keying features or notches. Once you line these up, gently lower the processor in a vertical motion into the socket. Take care not to insert the processor at an angle, since this may damage the socket pins. Once the processor is properly seated flush to the socket, close the top plate, making sure it goes under the post. Then, latch the locking lever to complete the processor installation. The protective cap should disengage once this action is done. If it doesn't, gently remove it. Now the board is ready for the thermal solution to be installed. Position the thermal solution so that the fasteners align with the board openings, making sure that the fan cable will reach the connector on the board. Installing the fasteners in a crisscross pattern is recommended. Push down on the first fastener until it locks into place. Then, do the same for the opposite fastener until all 4 fasteners are locked in place. Then, attach the power cable from the thermal solution to the connector on the motherboard. This completes the installation. It is a good idea to keep the processor clamshell and board socket protective cap in the event you ever need to transport either item. Thank you for watching this video.
You're welcome. Wow, that was totally the wrong video. I had the wrong one queued up. Let's try that again. Okay, here we go.
Every year or so, we add a new video to our Bit series, a series on YouTube dedicated to teaching computer users about bits and how they affect them in everyday computer use. Bits are everywhere in the tech world, and they're really just small pieces of information stored on a computer. And today we're going to take a look at the differences between a 32 and a 64-bit operating system. Some users may not know the difference, and some users may be completely unaware as to what the subject is. There are a lot of tech enthusiasts out there, but most computer users are just regular consumers, and that's great. But I will admit that the difference between these two types of systems has not been explained that well to the consumer market. So what is all the fuss about between these two types of systems? Well, let's take a look. In terms of numbers, the maximum value a 32-bit number can handle is about 4 billion. The actual number is a bit higher. This can apply to many different things: colors in an image, sounds that a music file produces. But for personal computing, it applies to the amount of RAM that we can use in the system. We'll talk more about RAM in a bit. A 32-bit operating system can allocate about 4 gigabytes of random access memory, that is RAM. Some limits may vary based on hardware and software configuration, but mathematically that is the limit. There are some exceptions, such as a PAE, which can address more than 4 gigs of RAM on a 32-bit operating system. So we receive the maximum value of a 32-bit number by taking 2 to the 32nd power. Now if we raise that to the 64th power, that is the maximum number we can receive with a 64-bit value. When translated into bytes, and then into exabytes, we can get about 16 exabytes of RAM. That's about 16 billion gigabytes. So this large number basically removes any kind of RAM cap for technology of today. Now let's talk about why RAM is so special. Think about your hard drive. You store all of your personal files on there, and you have a lot of space to store all of your data. RAM works a little bit differently though. It stores data temporarily to help the computer. It does not store as much data as a hard drive, but the advantage is that RAM can transfer data way faster than a hard drive can, even faster than a solid-state drive. So if the RAM acts faster than a hard drive, a user would typically want more data to be temporarily stored on the RAM. So the more free RAM that the computer has available to itself, the faster the system can respond under a heavier load. Sometimes when you're using a computer, you see a not responding sign on your window. Or if you're running a lot of apps at once, things start to slow down a bit. Or if you're running an intensive application like Adobe products, those applications are resource intensive, and the more RAM that is free to run those applications, the faster those apps will respond and perform tasks under heavier system loads. To keep it simple, you can do more things at once faster than normal. So now you know a little bit of what bits are and why RAM is important. So what now? Well, the good news is a lot of modern computers already sell with 64-bit versions of an operating system and a 64-bit processor. But maybe you're not sure what kind of system you're running. Well, here's a few things you can check. The first thing to check is your CPU's architecture. Then check to make sure you are running a 64-bit operating system. It is also recommended that you have over 4 GB of RAM installed if you are going to take advantage of a 64-bit architecture. And also make sure that when you're running an application that it is 64-bit. 32-bit apps will run on a 64-bit system, but you'll only get the true advantage with 64-bit applications. If you're on Windows 8, press Windows key I on your keyboard and click PC Info.
Windows 8.
Windows 8 will tell you if your operating system and CPU are 64-bit based. It will also tell you if one differs from the other. Other versions of Windows may only tell you whether or not your operating system is 64 or 32-bit. They may not report on what type of processor you have directly. To figure out if your processor is 64-bit capable, you may have to look up the model. If you are on a Mac, then determining whether or not your system is 64 or 32-bit is much easier. Essentially, if you're on an Intel Core 2 Duo or later, you are 64-bit. There was, however, an older computer that was 64-bit capable as well, and that was the Power Mac G5. We have received a lot of great comments and questions over the years, and we are not hesitant to answer any other questions you may have. Just leave them in the comments below. However, I'm going to quickly go over a few common questions that I get. A lot of people ask me if this affects games. Typically, this would not affect games that much because a lot of games do not require more than 4 GB of RAM to run properly. However, some heavier and more intensive games and game mods, such as the Half-Life 2 Cinematic mod, recommend that you have at least 4 GB of RAM. I tried running the game on a 32-bit system that could only address about 3 GB of RAM, and the game kept stuttering and it had some crashing issues. So in that case, having a 64-bit system and at least 4 GB of RAM is not a bad idea. Another frequently asked question we get is about upgrading. The good news is, when you buy a copy of Windows, Microsoft gives you a 32-bit and a 64-bit copy. If you're running a 32-bit system and you want to install 64-bit, insert the 64-bit disk into your computer and boot into that installer.
There's similar issues with Linux distributions.
System, but this will wipe out your personal information, so make sure you have a backup of your data. However, you may be given the option to move your data into the Windows.old folder, so your personal information will still be on the computer, but it will not be in the normal folders and directories that it was before the installation, so your files may be not in the same place they were before you upgraded. But it is still recommended that you have a separate backup, and make sure you have a 64-bit compatible CPU, because without 64-bit hardware, you could not run 64-bit software. So that is the quick rundown of the 64-bit advantage for personal computing.
Thank you.